At exactly 6:47 in the morning on March 14th, 1944, a young American sergeant named Jacob Morrison lay completely motionless in a muddy shell crater 200 yards from German lines near Anzio, Italy. Five enemy spotters had him triangulated. Three MG-42 machine gun nests were waiting for any sign of movement. His own lieutenant had forbidden him from being there just 48 hours earlier. In the next 4 hours, Jacob would eliminate every single one of those German positions without firing a single shot, using a technique so dangerous that his commanding officers had explicitly banned it. They called it Shadow Link. And by sunset, it would change the course of the Italian campaign forever. The mud in that crater was cold. February rains had turned the Italian countryside into a soup of clay and death. Jacob could feel it seeping through his uniform, could taste the metallic tang of it mixed with cordite and something else, something sweet and rotten that he tried not to think about. Bodies decompose differently in Italian mud than they did in Kentucky soil. He knew this now, knew it in ways that would never leave him. Above the crater rim, he could hear German voices, faint, conversational. One of them was laughing about something. The sound carried across no man's land like it was traveling through water. In the distance, artillery rumbled. American guns, probably, firing at coordinates that would miss their targets because the German spotters were still alive, still calling in adjustments, still turning American advances into slaughter. Jacob closed his eyes and counted his heartbeats. 62 per minute. Slower than it should be for a man lying in enemy crosshairs. But fear was a luxury he'd learned to set aside back in the coal mines of Harlan County, where panic got you killed just as surely as carelessness. He'd been preparing for this moment his entire life. He just hadn't known it until 2 months ago, when he watched 42 men from Baker Company get torn apart by German artillery that arrived with impossible precision. When he realized that all the training, all the doctrine, all the rules that West Point officers swore by were getting good men killed. Sometimes the only way forward is to break every rule you've been taught. Sometimes survival demands you become something the rulebook never imagined. Jacob Morrison had learned to see in darkness when he was 8 years old. In the coal mines 300 feet below Harlan County, where light was a luxury and the black was so complete it had weight, where you navigated by sound and touch and the smell of different rock faces, where the timber creaked warnings and water dripping meant danger, and the scrape of boots on stone told you which crew was where without ever seeing a face. His father had taken him down on a summer morning in 1936. Not to work. Jacob was too young for that. But to understand. To see where the Morrison men spent their days, where they'd spent generations of days, going back to his great-grandfather who'd come over from Scotland in 1887 with nothing but a strong back and a willingness to dig. The cage had rattled as it descended, a metal box on a cable dropping into earth. Jacob remembered gripping his father's hand, feeling the calluses, the coal dust ground so deep into the skin it would never wash out. His father hadn't said much, never did. But when they reached the bottom and stepped out into that absolute darkness, he'd knelt down and put both hands on Jacob's shoulders. "Light ruins your other senses, boy," his father had said. His voice echoed off limestone walls. "Down here you learn to see with your ears, with your hands, with your nose. You understand me?" Jacob had understood. Over the next 6 years, he became something the other miners talked about in quiet voices. The kid who ran messages between shaft crews in darkness, so complete that grown men with 30 years underground wouldn't navigate it without lamps. Who moved through the tunnels like he could see when he couldn't. Who just knew. Knew by the way sound bounced off different rock faces, knew by the temperature shifts that meant ventilation shafts or gas pockets, knew by the taste of the air whether he was near the main seam or in the abandoned western passages that hadn't been worked since his grandfather's time. At 14, Jacob Morrison was running full shifts as a messenger. $5 a week, money his family needed. His father was getting older, lungs showing the first signs of coal dust damage. His mother took in laundry. His younger sister needed shoes. So Jacob went down into the earth 6 days a week and learned every tunnel, every junction, every passage in the Morrison mine. He memorized it the way other boys memorized baseball statistics, not by sight, by feel, by pattern, by the way different sections of tunnel had different acoustics, different smells, different textures of wall. The older miners thought he was showing off, running without a lamp, moving through darkness like it was nothing. Until the day in May of 1940 when the western shaft collapsed and 6 men got trapped in a maze of side passages that weren't on any official map. Passages that had been sealed off decades ago and then forgotten. Except Jacob knew them, had explored them on his lunch breaks, counting steps, reading walls with his fingers, building a three-dimensional map in his mind. The foreman had been close to panic. The main tunnel was blocked by tons of rubble. They could hear the trapped miners calling out, voices muffled by rock and distance. But digging through would take days. Days those men didn't have. The air in those passages was limited. Maybe 8 hours if they stayed calm. Maybe 4 if they panicked. The foreman looked at Jacob Morrison, 16 years old, skinny kid with coal dust in his hair and old eyes. "Can you get to them?" Jacob had closed his eyes, pictured the mine in his head. Every tunnel laid out like a map. He could see the cave in point, could trace the routes around it through abandoned passages that spiraled and intersected in ways that made no sense unless you'd walked them in total darkness with nothing but memory to guide you. "Yes, sir," Jacob said. "I can get to them." And he did. 423 steps down the main shaft to Junction 7, left turn, 89 steps through the narrow passage where you had to crouch because the ceiling dropped to 5 feet. Straight, down 56 steps on the old ladder with 3 rungs missing, the ones Jacob had memorized by their spacing. Through the water seepage area where you had to wade through ankle-deep cold that smelled like minerals and time. In pitch darkness, Jacob Morrison guided those 6 men out. The youngest was 19, scared out of his mind, holding on to Jacob's belt like a lifeline. The oldest was William Cross, 54, who'd worked these mines since he was 12. Cross had a bum leg from a slate fall in 33 and couldn't move fast. But Jacob adjusted his pace, counted his steps out loud so Cross could follow the rhythm, kept his voice calm even when they had to squeeze through a passage so narrow Jacob's shoulders scraped both walls. When they emerged into daylight, when all 6 men were safe and the families were crying, and the foreman was shaking Jacob's hand, William Cross pulled the boy aside, put his weathered hand on Jacob's shoulder, and looked at him with eyes that understood something most people never would. "Son," Cross said quietly, "you don't see with your eyes. You see with something deeper." Jacob Morrison didn't know it then, standing in Kentucky sunlight with coal dust on his face and his heart still hammering from the rescue. Didn't know that the skill he just demonstrated, that ability to navigate by pattern and sound and feel, would save hundreds of lives 4 years later, on a battlefield 4,000 miles away, against an enemy that thought themselves safe because American soldiers fought by the rules. December 8, 1942, the day after his 18th birthday, the day after Pearl Harbor's first anniversary. Jacob Morrison walked into the recruiting office in Lexington, Kentucky, and raised his right hand. His mother cried, had been crying since he told her 2 days earlier. His father shook his hand, didn't say anything, just looked at Jacob with eyes that held too much understanding. His sister hugged him and made him promise to write. By January, he was at Fort Benning, Georgia, learning to kill people instead of saving them from cave-ins, learning to move through enemy territory instead of mine shafts, learning that the Army had rules for everything, and most of those rules were designed by men who'd never been in darkness that wanted you dead. The night training exercises were where things got interesting. Sergeant William Cross, the same William Cross from the mine rescue, had enlisted in 1942 at age 56 by lying about his age. The Army needed instructors. Cross knew things about moving in darkness that no field manual could teach, so they made him a sergeant and put him in charge of night navigation training at Fort Benning. Cross recognized Jacob the first week, said nothing about it, just watched. 40 recruits in the Georgia woods on a January night, temperature around 45 degrees, humidity thick enough to taste, the smell of pine needles and red clay and fear. Every recruit had a flashlight, a compass, a map. The mission was simple. Navigate 2 miles through forest to a checkpoint. Don't get lost. Don't fall in a ravine. Don't embarrass yourself. 39 recruits clicked their flashlights on and off, checked compasses, argued in whispers, stumbled over roots, walked into low branches, made enough noise to alert every German in a 5-mile radius if this had been real. Private Jacob Morrison moved through that darkness without any light at all. He listened to the other recruits, used their noise as waypoints, moved when the wind rustled through the pines so the sound of his boots disappeared into the general whisper of the forest, felt the ground beneath his feet, reading slope and texture, smelled the difference between pine stands and hardwood groves, heard water running somewhere to his left, used it as a navigation marker. He reached the checkpoint 17 minutes before anyone else, wasn't even breathing hard. Sergeant Cross was waiting there, standing in darkness with a small red lens flashlight that wouldn't ruin night vision. He looked at Jacob for a long moment. "Morrison," Cross said, "how did you navigate without light?" Jacob shrugged. "Same way I did in the mines, Sergeant. Listened for everyone else. Moved in the gaps between their attention." Cross stared at him, really stared, like he was seeing something that shouldn't exist. "You just described advanced infiltration tactics," Cross finally said, "and you figured it out digging coal." "Yes, Sergeant." "Well, congratulations, Private. You're now a scout." By February 1943, Jacob was training with the 3rd Infantry Division. By October, they were loading onto ships for the Mediterranean. By January 1944, he was crossing dark water toward a place called Anzio, surrounded by 800 men who had no idea what they were sailing into. The LST-387 smelled like diesel fuel and salt water and the sweat of too many bodies packed too close. Jacob lay in his bunk, listening to the rhythm of waves against the hull, listening to the nervous chatter of men who knew that in 72 hours they'd be under fire. Men who told stories about their girls back home, their jobs they'd return to, the cars they wanted to buy, the houses they'd build. Jacob had made friends on that voyage. Good men. Private James Daugherty from Tennessee, who played harmonica in the evenings. Slow songs that made everyone think about home. Songs that the chaplain eventually asked him to stop playing because they were making the men too sad, too aware of what they might lose. Corporal Vincent Palmieri from New Jersey, a welder before the war, could fix anything, had already repaired 3 different pieces of equipment on the ship that the Navy mechanics had given up on, talked constantly about his girl Maria, how he was going to marry her the day he got back, how they'd already picked out an apartment in Newark. Sergeant Robert Hayes from Oregon, 32 years old, quiet strength, the kind of man other men followed naturally. He'd promised Jacob he'd teach him to fly fish after the war, in the Rogue River where the salmon ran, had made Jacob promise something in return. They were sitting on deck one evening, watching the sun set over the Mediterranean. The water was impossibly blue. Hayes had been quiet for a long time. Then he turned to Jacob. "Morrison," Hayes said, "if you survive this war, you make damn sure it means something. Don't just survive. Make the dying count for something." Jacob had promised, not understanding yet what that promise would cost, what it would demand, how it would echo through 43 years of life and visit him on his deathbed. January 22nd, 1944. The landing at Anzio. The first day went smoothly, too smoothly, minimal resistance. By nightfall, 36,000 Allied troops held a beachhead 16 miles wide and 7 miles deep. Officers were talking about Rome, about breakthrough, about ending the Italian campaign by spring. Then the trap closed. German forces in the Olben Hills surrounded the beachhead like a noose. Artillery positions dug into high ground with perfect sight lines to every Allied position. Observation posts where German spotters could see everything. Every movement, every supply run, every troop rotation. Jacob Morrison's first night at Anzio, he lay in a foxhole that smelled like turned earth and fear, listening to sounds he'd never forget, the distant whine of German 80mm shells, like fabric tearing, like the sky being ripped open. High-pitched and terrifying. Then the crack of impact, then the screams, the smell of cordite mixing with wet earth, and underneath it, something else. Something his nose recognized from the mines but his mind didn't want to acknowledge. The metallic sweetness of blood. Lots of it. Every movement drew fire. Men died fetching water, died moving supplies 50 yards, died trying to dig their foxholes deeper, Died doing everything right and still dying because the German spotters were calling in coordinates with precision that seemed impossible to stop. February 8, 1944. Dawn. Baker Company received orders to probe German positions near Cisterna. Standard reconnaissance in force. Move forward, draw fire. Identify enemy positions. Simple. By the book. Jacob was assigned as forward scout, but Lieutenant Christopher Hayes held him back at the last minute. Division was sending a sniper team to eliminate the spotters in that bombed-out farmhouse to the north. No point risking a scout when they had the perfect doctrinal solution. Perfect solution. 42 men from Baker Company advanced across open ground. Jacob watched through binoculars from 400 yards back. For 90 seconds, it looked like it might work. Then he saw it. A tiny flash of reflected sunlight from the farmhouse. Binoculars catching morning light. A German spotter adjusting position. Jacob grabbed the radio. Baker Company, this is Morrison. You've got spotters at your... The first shells arrived before he finished the sentence. German 80-mm artillery makes a distinctive sound. First, the distant thump of the gun firing, then the whistle rising in pitch as the shell arcs overhead, then the crack of impact. But when German spotters have you bracketed perfectly, there's no gap between whistle and crack. They arrive as one terrible sound. Baker Company was in the open. No cover, no time. The barrage lasted 4 minutes. When it stopped, 37 men were dead or dying. 5 were wounded badly enough they'd be sent home. 4 walked away. Jacob Morrison lowered his binoculars and vomited into the mud. When he looked up, he saw the German spotters, 2 of them, calmly packing up their equipment, preparing to relocate before American counter-battery fire could find them. They'd just killed 42 Americans. Now they'd move, set up somewhere else, do it again tomorrow. Jacob saw Doherty's body. What was left of it? The harmonica was still in his pocket. Jacob could see it from 400 yards away because there wasn't much else left to see. Palmieri had taken shrapnel to the chest, died calling for Maria, calling for his girl in Newark who'd never wear the wedding dress they'd picked out together. Hayes had caught it in the legs, bled out over 18 minutes. Jacob had heard it on the radio. Hayes calling for a medic, the medic trying to reach him, the medic dying too. Hayes going quiet. That night, Jacob Morrison sat in his tent staring at a map, not sleeping, not eating, just staring. The German spotter positions were marked, 5 of them, working in a network that covered the entire Anzio perimeter, calling in artillery that killed American boys by the dozen, by the hundred. The snipers couldn't get them. Too alert. Too well protected. Artillery couldn't suppress them because they moved constantly. Airstrikes were too imprecise. The doctrine wasn't working. The rules were getting men killed. But Jacob had been thinking about something, a technique he'd been developing during night patrols. Not officially, not with permission, just testing, experimenting, based on how he'd navigated coal mine shafts, based on understanding that humans have patterns, rhythms, blind spots that have nothing to do with vision. He called it shadow link. The idea was simple but completely insane. Instead of hiding from the enemy, you moved in their blind spots by tracking their attention patterns. You became part of their environment, a shadow that existed at the edge of awareness but never quite resolved into a target. It required memorizing where spotters looked and when, how often they swept sectors, when they adjusted binoculars, when they reached for radio equipment. You had to map their pattern the way Jacob used to map tunnel sounds, then move in the gaps between their observations. Not when they weren't looking. That was impossible to predict. But when their attention was committed elsewhere, focused so completely on one sector that peripheral awareness collapsed. Jacob had tested it on 4 night patrols over 3 weeks, each time getting closer to German positions that were supposed to be impenetrable. On the last patrol, he'd gotten within 30 feet of a spotter team, close enough to hear them talking about girlfriends in Hamburg, close enough to count the buttons on their uniforms. Then he'd marked their exact positions and called in an artillery strike that killed 20 Germans with 0 American casualties. Lieutenant Hayes had noticed the results, the precision. Every position Jacob reported was accurate within 5 yards. On March 12th, Jacob wrote up a 12-page report, explained the shadow link technique in detail, how it worked, why it worked, how it could be used to eliminate the spotter positions that were slaughtering American troops. He handed it to Lieutenant Hayes. Hayes read it twice, then called Jacob into his tent. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Jacob remembered every second. "This is insane," Hayes said, tossing the report on his field desk. "You're describing stalking techniques, not reconnaissance. It violates every principle of scouting doctrine." "It works," Jacob said quietly. "It works until it doesn't. One mistake and you're captured or dead. We can't afford to lose scouts, Morrison." "We're losing squads, Lieutenant. Entire platoons. Hayes is dead. Anderson is dead. Doherty, Palmieri." "Don't." Hayes's voice went hard. "Don't use their names to justify this. I knew those men too." Silence. Outside, distant artillery. Hayes stood up, walked to the tent entrance, looked out at the Italian night. "I'm giving you a direct order, Sergeant Morrison. You are forbidden from attempting this shadow link technique. You will not close within 100 yards of enemy positions. You will conduct standard reconnaissance patrols only. Is that understood?" Jacob stood at attention. "Understood, sir." But walking out of that tent, Jacob knew something his lieutenant didn't know. In 48 hours, 5 German spotter positions would be eliminated. 12 enemy soldiers would die without a single shot fired, and Sergeant Jacob Morrison would either be court-martialed or change how America fought wars. There was no middle ground. March 14th began at 4:30 in the morning. Jacob woke with the rest of his squad still sleeping. The air was cold, maybe 45 degrees. He could see his breath, could smell coffee from the mess tent but didn't go get any. Caffeine makes your hands shake. He packed quietly. Trench knife, 7 inches of carbon steel with brass knuckle grip, 2 canteens filled with water, compass, map with 5 positions marked in pencil. No rifle. Rifles make noise. No grenades. Grenades make more noise. Just the knife. At 4:47, Jacob Morrison slipped through the perimeter wire and walked into no man's land. A sentry challenged him. Morrison said he couldn't sleep, going for an early patrol. The sentry knew him, the coal miner who moved at night. Let him pass. There's a moment when you cross from your lines into no man's land, when you leave the zone where your artillery can support you, where your machine guns can cover retreat, when you become completely alone. Jacob felt that moment at exactly 4:52 as he crawled through the wire, felt the shift from soldier to something else, from scout to hunter. 5 positions, 12 German spotters, 16 hours of daylight, 0 margin for error. The first position was a collapsed barn 300 yards northwest. Jacob had been watching it for a week, 2 German spotters in rotation. Every 14 minutes they swapped roles. For 6 seconds, both focused on equipment exchange, neither watching sectors. 6 seconds. The approach was a drainage ditch, 3 inches of water that smelled like sewage and death. Jacob started crawling at 5:30. The water was 40 degrees. Within 5 minutes, his fingers were numb. Within 10, his chest ached from cold. The smell was overwhelming. Human waste, decomposition, things he didn't want to identify. He moved 6 inches at a time. 200 yards took 90 minutes. At 7:53, he was 20 feet from the barn wall. He could hear them. German voices. Conversational. "Der Kaffee ist scheiße." Coffee is shit. "Greta in München vermisst mich." Greta in Munich misses me. 19-year-old kids. Talking about coffee and girls. In 90 seconds, they'd be dead. At 8:07, the radio crackled. Both spotters turned toward the equipment. Jacob moved. 20 feet in 4 seconds. Through the wall gap, low and fast. The first spotter turned his head at the last moment, mouth opening to shout. The trench knife caught him under the jaw, angled upward, severing the screen before it could form. 8 seconds. Silent except for wet sounds Jacob would hear in dreams for the rest of his life. The second spotter reached for his rifle. Jacob yanked the knife free, drove it into the man's throat. 5 more seconds. Both dead. No shots. Just silence. Jacob dragged the bodies to the cellar. His hands were shaking, not from cold anymore, from what he'd just done, from crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He stumbled outside and vomited behind rubble. Then he smashed the radio, marked his map. Move toward position 2. 4 positions left. 10 more spotters. And Jacob Morrison was learning what it cost to save lives by taking them. I'll craft a narrative rhythm that pulses like a heartbeat, creating sonic waves that capture listener attention. Strategic emotional triggers will punctuate key moments, ensuring maximum engagement through psychological resonance. Each narrative beat will be carefully constructed to maintain psychological tension and create immersive auditory experiences that keep the audience locked into the story's intense psychological landscape. Position 2 was an olive grove 600 yards east. 3 German spotters. More sophisticated equipment. Younger men, probably. Wehrmacht veterans rotated back from the Eastern Front. Men who'd survived Russia knew how to stay alert. Jacob approached from downwind. The morning sun was climbing higher now, warming the Italian mud. Steam rose from shell craters. The smell of cordite had faded, replaced by something earthier. Olive trees and wild rosemary, and underneath it all that sweet, sick smell of no man's land that never quite went away. He'd been observing this position for 9 days, long enough to know their pattern. 3 spotters working in overlapping sectors: North Watcher, South Watcher, Artillery Coordinator. Every 20 minutes they rotated positions. Textbook German efficiency. No gaps in coverage. No obvious weakness. Except humans aren't machines. Machines don't get bored, don't get distracted, don't collapse their attention inward when dealing with each other instead of the enemy. Jacob watched from a crater 200 yards out. The sun was behind him now, working in his favor. When the Germans looked east, they were looking into glare, pupils contracting, vision compromised. Another gift from the coal mines where Jacob had learned that light could be as much enemy as ally. At 9:15, the rotation happened. All 3 spotters focused inward for exactly 15 seconds, handing off equipment, checking coordinates, confirming sectors. In those 15 seconds, their peripheral awareness collapsed to nothing. But 15 seconds wasn't enough time to cross 200 yards. Jacob needed another advantage: wind. The olive trees were old, planted before the war, before Mussolini, maybe before the Great War. Their branches thick with early spring leaves that rustled when the wind blew. In the coal mines, timber creaked. Down here, trees whispered. Same principle. Sound masking. Move when nature makes noise and your boots disappear into the general chorus of the world. He waited for the wind. At 10:47, a strong gust came through. The olive grove turned into a wave of silver green as leaves showed their undersides. The sound was like rain on a tin roof. White noise that swallowed everything. Jacob sprinted 20 yards, dropped flat behind a low stone wall. Waited. 3 minutes later, another gust. Another 20-yard sprint. Closer now. Close enough to see the spotters clearly. One was smoking. One was writing in a logbook. The third was scanning the Allied lines through binoculars. Professional, disciplined, doing everything right. It wouldn't save them. At 11:28, Jacob was 50 yards out, hidden behind a burned-out farm cart that had been there since the January fighting. The wood was charred black, smelled like old smoke and rust from the metal wheel rims. Close enough now to hear their conversation. His German wasn't perfect, but he understood enough. They were arguing about artillery coordinates for an Allied supply convoy they'd spotted. One was pointing at a map. The others were leaning in to look. All 3 focused on the map, nobody watching outward. Jacob moved during the next wind gust. 30 yards in 5 seconds. Fast but not reckless. Boots finding soft ground. No gravel. No branches. Just grass still wet with morning dew. 10 feet from their position, he froze. Controlled his breathing. Waited. They were still arguing. One of them gestured emphatically at the map. Here, 2 Kilometer Nord. Here, 2 kilometers north. The others leaned closer. Jacob went in. Fast and surgical. The trench knife had been designed for exactly this. Close quarters, multiple targets. No time for hesitation. The artillery coordinator died first. Left hand over mouth, right hand driving the blade into the kidney, then upward through the diaphragm into the heart. The body went rigid, tried to scream against Jacob's palm. 6 seconds of muffled struggle, then nothing. Jacob lowered him silently to the ground. The North Watcher was turning. Saw Jacob, eyes going wide. hand reaching for the Luger on the table. Too slow. Jacob's knife took him in the throat, left to right, severing the carotid and trachea in one motion. Blood sprayed. The sound was terrible, wet and gurgling. The man collapsed across the table, hands clawing at his neck. 14 seconds total. The South Watcher was the youngest. Couldn't have been more than 19. He lunged for the rifle leaning against the tree. Jacob intercepted him, drove the knife between the fourth and fifth ribs, straight into the heart, felt the blade scrape bone, felt the body convulse once, twice, then go still. 3 men dead in 22 seconds. Jacob stood there breathing hard. His hands were covered in blood up to the wrists. The youngest German was staring at him, eyes still open, still seeing, still holding something in his expression that Jacob couldn't name and didn't want to. He forced himself to search the bodies, found nothing useful, just photographs, letters, personal effects that told stories Jacob didn't want to know. A picture of the artillery coordinator with a woman and 2 children. The North Watcher had a letter half written. The youngest had a prayer book in his pocket. Jacob left them where they fell, smashed the radio equipment with the butt of a German rifle, the sophisticated artillery plotting table, the maps with American positions marked, all of it reduced to splinters and sparks. He marked his map. Position 2 eliminated, 11:34, 3 positions left, 7 more men, and the day was only half over. Position 3 was the one that mattered most, the ruined pillbox on Hill 73. The place where Sergeant Robert Hayes had died 3 weeks ago, where 42 men from Baker Company had been slaughtered because German spotters called in perfect coordinates. This one was personal. Jacob studied it from a crater 200 yards south. The pillbox was pre-war Italian construction, concrete and steel, built to guard the approach to Rome back when Mussolini thought Italy would be a Mediterranean power. The January fighting had damaged it, but not destroyed it. Chunks of concrete blown away. Rebar exposed like broken bones. But the observation slit was still intact. And through that slit, 2 German spotters had clear sight lines in every direction. 400 yards of open ground, scattered rubble for minimal cover, and 2 very alert Germans who'd survived this long by being better than average. Jacob sat in that crater and watched for 3 hours. The sun climbed higher. Temperature rose to 82 degrees. His water was running low. 1 canteen empty. The second 3/4 gone. His shoulders burned from all the crawling. His uniform was stiff with dried blood. None of it his. All of it weight he'd carry forever. But he watched, waited, learned their pattern. They were good, very good. Sweeps every 30 seconds, methodical, overlapping, no obvious gaps. One would watch while the other updated their log. Then they'd switch. Seamless coordination, but everyone has to eat. At 1:47, one of the spotters set down his binoculars, unwrapped something, probably bread, German field rations. The second spotter continued scanning, but now he was doing the work of 2 men. His sweeps became faster, less thorough, trying to cover twice the area in the same time. That was the gap Jacob needed. He started crawling at 1:52. The ground was different here, more exposed. The February rains had washed away topsoil, leaving patches of pale clay that stood out against darker earth. Jacob had to choose his route carefully, stay on dark ground. Avoid the pale patches that would show movement. Elbows and knees, face in the dirt, the taste of Italian soil mixing with sweat and exhaustion. His body was starting to fail. 22 hours without sleep, 14 hours of sustained stress, dehydration setting in, muscles trembling from effort. But Hayes had died here, right here on this God-forsaken hill, calling for a medic who couldn't reach him, bleeding out over 18 minutes while German spotters watched through binoculars and did nothing, because why would they? Jacob kept crawling. At 2:31, he reached the pillbox's eastern wall, the blind spot, collapsed section where a shell had taken out 10 feet of concrete. He could hear them inside now. German voices, one complaining about the heat. Zu heiß, too hot. The other saying something about a girlfriend in Hamburg. Meine Freundin schreibt mir nicht mehr. My girlfriend doesn't write anymore. Ordinary men, living ordinary lives interrupted by war. Men who probably didn't want to be here any more than Jacob wanted to be hunting them. But they'd killed Hayes and Doherty and Palmieri and 42 others. And they'd do it again tomorrow if Jacob let them live. He moved along the wall, 12 feet to the entrance. 4 minutes to cover that distance. So slow that movement became something else. Became a meditation. Became a conversation with death about who got to decide who lived. At the entrance he paused, listened. One spotter was chewing. The other was adjusting radio dials. Static crackle. German voices far away calling coordinates for artillery strikes somewhere else on the beachhead. Jacob went in fast. The light inside was dim after the bright Italian sun. His eyes took a second to adjust. That second almost killed him. The first spotter turned, saw Jacob, reached for the Luger on the table. Jacob's knife took him in the chest, straight into the heart. The man's eyes went wide. His mouth opened. Tried to say something. Bit. Please. Cut off by blood. He died staring at Jacob, recognition in his eyes, understanding that this was how it ended. 8 seconds. The second spotter dropped his food, grabbed for the rifle. Jacob yanked the knife free, threw it. The blade tumbled once in the air. Jacob watched it rotate, watched it embed in the German's throat. The man collapsed backward, clawing at the handle, making terrible sounds. Gurgling, choking, taking 18 seconds to die. The longest death so far. Jacob retrieved his knife. Had to pull hard. The blade was stuck in vertebrae. When it came free, there was a sound like breaking branches. He sat down against the wall. His hands were shaking violently. Not from fear, not from cold, from the accumulated weight of killing, from the faces, from the sounds, from the knowledge that he was crossing distances that couldn't be recrossed. The German with the girlfriend in Hamburg was still warm. His letter was on the table, written in careful script. Liebste Christina. Dearest Christina. Jacob didn't read more. Didn't want to know. Didn't want to carry those words with all the other things he'd carry. He closed the dead man's eyes. Human decency even here, even now. Then he destroyed the radio, marked his map. 3:02 in the afternoon, 2 positions left. But they were different, more dangerous. Position 4 was a burned farmhouse 800 yards south. Position 5 was in a tree line overlooking the main supply route, both within sight of each other. Mutual support. If either position saw anything unusual near the other, they'd radio a warning. German infantry would swarm the area. Jacob couldn't approach in daylight. He had to wait for dark. 6 hours in a rubble pile 300 yards from both positions. Hiding, conserving energy, rationing water. 1 sip every hour from a canteen that was nearly empty. The sun peaked at 4 in the afternoon. Temperature hit 88 degrees. Jacob's uniform was soaked. Salt stains showing white against olive drab. His lips were cracked. When he ran his tongue over them, he tasted blood. Hunger was a constant hollow ache. He hadn't eaten since yesterday evening. 26 hours. His body was running on adrenaline and will. Nothing else left. But the waiting was worse than the hunger, worse than the thirst, because waiting meant thinking, and thinking meant seeing faces, hearing sounds, reliving every kill in perfect detail. 17 men dead by his hand, 17 faces he'd never forget, 17 voices cut off mid-breath, 17 futures erased. For what? To save American lives, to stop the spotters who were killing his brothers, to do what the rules wouldn't allow because the rules were written by men who'd never crawled through sewage toward an enemy who'd kill you without hesitation. Jacob didn't know if that was enough justification, didn't know if anything could justify what he was becoming, but Hayes's promise echoed in his mind. Make the dying count for something, all of it. The Germans and the Americans. Make it mean something. At 6:22, the sun dropped behind the Olben Hills. Twilight settled over Anzio like a blessing. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 20 minutes. The air smelled different. Dew forming, earth releasing heat, night birds starting their calls. Jacob watched the 2 remaining positions. Couldn't see the men anymore, but he could see their cigarettes, small orange glows in the gathering dark. And he realized something. Night vision takes 30 minutes to fully develop, but anything bright destroys it instantly. A cigarette ember is bright enough to ruin night vision for 30 seconds after every drag. The Germans were smoking regularly, every 8 to 12 minutes, taking drags every 45 to 60 seconds. Every time that ember brightened, they were blind. Jacob started his approach toward position 4 at 6:35, 800 yards through darkness that felt like home. Like the coal mines where he'd learned that darkness wasn't something to fear. It was something to use. He moved in rhythm with their cigarettes. Watch the ember brighten. Advance 8 feet. Freeze. Watch it dim. Hold position. Watch it brighten again. Move. 95 minutes to cover 800 yards. Patient as stone. Inevitable as winter. At 8:04, he was inside the farmhouse. 2 German spotters, one asleep in the corner, snoring softly, the other monitoring radio traffic with his back to the door, headphones on, writing in a log. This was the first luck Jacob had encountered all day. Maybe the only luck. He killed the sleeping one first, quick and quiet. The man never woke, just stopped snoring. Stopped breathing, transitioned from sleep to death without ever knowing the difference. The radio operator heard something, started to turn. Jacob's knife caught him in the throat before the turn completed. The headphones fell. The man's hands went to his neck. Tried to stop the bleeding. Couldn't. Blood pulsing between fingers. Eyes wide, mouth working. No sound except wet gurgling. 15 men dead now. 15 German soldiers who'd never go home. Jacob was 19 years old. And somewhere deep inside, a voice was asking if there was any coming back from this. If you could kill 15 men and still be human, still be the person who'd saved 6 miners in Kentucky darkness. He didn't have an answer, but he did have a plan. Instead of destroying this radio like the others, Jacob used it, keyed the microphone, transmitted random static for 30 seconds, bursts and squeals and electronic noise that meant nothing, then went silent. At position 5, 400 yards away in the tree line, the German spotters would be listening, hearing their sister position transmit nonsense, wondering what it meant. Radio malfunction, equipment failure, or something worse. They'd argue about it. And while they argued, they wouldn't be watching their sectors. Jacob left the farmhouse and moved toward the tree line. He could see them now through the darkness. 2 silhouettes backlit by a small lamp inside their position, gesturing, voices rising. Wir sollten nachsehen. We should go check. Es ist nur ein Funkfehler. It's just a radio malfunction, neither watching outward. Both focused on the mystery, on each other, on whether to abandon their position. 400 yards in 18 minutes. Jacob moved through darkness like water flowing downhill. Inevitable, silent, absolutely certain of the path. This was what he'd been training for his entire life, since he was 8 years old in Kentucky mines. Learning to navigate by feel and sound. Learning to become part of the darkness itself. The Germans in that tent might as well have been standing in daylight. Jacob was the one who could see. At 8:47, he came through the tent flap like a shadow given form. 2 spotters. Both looked up. Both saw him. Too late. The first reached for his rifle. Jacob's knife opened his throat before fingers touched steel. The sound was terrible. The man fell backward. Blood spraying across maps and coordinates, across carefully plotted firing solutions that would never be used. The second lunged for the tent entrance, trying to escape, trying to warn someone, anyone. Jacob caught him from behind, left hand over mouth, right hand driving the knife between ribs 5 and 6. Angled upward toward the heart, the body convulsed, tried to scream against Jacob's palm, failed, went still. 17 German soldiers, 5 positions, 5 radio stations, 0 shots fired. Time was 8:55 in the evening, 14 hours and 8 minutes since Jacob had crawled through the perimeter wire into no man's land. He dragged the final bodies into underbrush, smashed the last radio, then sat down with his back against a tree and let the exhaustion hit him. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. His uniform was soaked with sweat and blood. His shoulders felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to them repeatedly. He was so dehydrated his throat barely worked when he tried to drink the last sips from his canteen. But he'd done it, broken every rule, violated direct orders, risked court-martial and death and damnation. But he'd done it. And sitting there in Italian darkness, Jacob Morrison made himself remember the promise. Hayes's promise on the transport ship. Make the dying count for something. All of it. The 17 Germans with their girlfriends and families. The American boys who wouldn't die tomorrow because these spotters couldn't call in coordinates anymore. Hayes and Anderson and Doherty and Palmieri. Make all of it count. The walk back took 3 hours. Should have taken 45 minutes, but Jacob could barely stand. His legs trembled. His vision went gray at the edges. Twice he fell. Once he lay in a shell crater for 15 minutes, staring at stars and wondering if he'd actually make it back or if they'd find him in the morning, dead from exhaustion 50 yards from friendly lines. But he got up, kept walking, one foot in front of the other. The most basic human movement reduced to an act of supreme will. At 11:53, he stumbled into the perimeter wire. A sentry challenged him, nearly shot him, recognized his face at the last second. Jesus Christ, Morrison, where have you been? Jacob's throat was so dry the words came out as a croak. Patrol. The sentry looked at him, at the blood, at the exhaustion, at whatever showed in Jacob's eyes that made the sentry step back. You need the medic? No, just need my tent. But his tent wasn't empty. Lieutenant Christopher Hayes was waiting, sitting at Jacob's field desk with a hurricane lamp burning, looking at a map, looking furious. And Jacob Morrison knew that the second war was about to begin, the one where he had to justify breaking every rule to men who'd written those rules in the safety of command posts. The war where the enemy wasn't German spotters. It was American doctrine, American bureaucracy, American officers who valued order over results. Jacob stood in the tent entrance, covered in mud and blood, swaying slightly, 19 years old and aged a decade and a day. Hayes looked up. Their eyes met. Where the hell have you been, Sergeant? And Jacob Morrison had to decide how much truth to tell, how much to confess, how much to defend. The kills were over. The real battle was just beginning. Jacob set down his pack. The trench knife was still sheathed, still bloody. His hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped somewhere on the long walk back, replaced by something else, something colder, more permanent. Patrol, Jacob said. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone older. Northwest sector. Hayes stood up, walked around the desk, looked at the blood on Jacob's uniform, at the mud, at the exhaustion carved into a face too young to wear it. Patrol where? You didn't file a route plan. German positions. The tent was silent except for distant artillery. Someone else's war, someone else's death. Always someone else, until suddenly it wasn't. Hayes stared at him, really stared, like he was trying to see past the blood and the mud into whatever Jacob had become in the last 14 hours. What did you do? Jacob pulled out his map, unfolded it on the desk. 5 positions marked in red, precise coordinates, exact locations, all the details an after-action report would need. 12 spotters, 5 radio stations, all eliminated, no shots fired, no Allied casualties. Hayes looked at the map, then at Jacob, then back at the map. His jaw was working, but no sound came out. You used the shadow link technique. Yes, sir. After I explicitly ordered you not to. Yes, sir. Hayes turned away, walked to the tent entrance, looked out at the dark Italian night where men were dying in ways that statistics would never capture. Do you understand what you've done? His voice was quiet, dangerous. This is insubordination. This is a court-martial offense. I could have you in chains by morning. Jacob met his eyes. No fear there. Fear had burned out somewhere between the second and third kill. Between the olive grove and the pillbox, between being a soldier who followed orders and becoming something else entirely. Hayes is still dead, Jacob said. So is Anderson, Doherty, Palmieri, all 42 men from Baker Company. I couldn't bring them back, but I could stop more from dying the same way. The words hung in the air between them. Truth too stark for comfort, too real for doctrine to answer. Hayes opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. You're confined to camp pending investigation. I'm reporting this up the chain. What happens next isn't my decision. Understood, sir. Dismissed. Jacob walked to his tent, lay down on his bunk still wearing the bloody uniform, closed his eyes, expected to see faces, expected nightmares. Instead, he fell into darkness so complete it felt like the coal mines, like home, like the only place he'd ever truly belonged. He slept for 4 hours. At 6:15 the next morning, March 15th, German artillery opened up on the Anzio beachhead with their usual dawn barrage. For 2 months, this had been the most dangerous time. Systematic, precise, deadly. Men died eating breakfast, died in latrines, died doing everything right and dying anyway, because German spotters could see everything. But this morning was different. The shells fell randomly, no coordination, no bracketing, no walking fire that adjusted onto targets with terrifying accuracy. Just blind firing based on pre-sighted coordinates that didn't account for troop movements during the night. A company moved up to probe Hill 73 at 6:45. No artillery response. They reached the pillbox without taking fire. Inside, they found Jacob Morrison's work. 2 dead German spotters, destroyed radio, maps torn, equipment smashed, and silence. Beautiful, terrible silence. By noon, word had spread through the division. Someone had eliminated 5 spotter positions in a single day. Officers didn't know who, didn't want to know yet because if it was unauthorized, they'd have to act. But enlisted men were making guesses. By evening, someone had figured it out. And the story spread like wildfire through the ranks. Jacob Morrison, the scout from Kentucky, the crazy bastard who did it alone. Men Jacob had never spoken to came up in the mess tent, shook his hand, thanked him, said things like, "My squad was supposed to advance there tomorrow," and "Those spotters killed my best friend," and "You saved my life, Morrison." Jacob didn't know what to say. Didn't feel like a hero. Felt like a killer who'd gotten lucky. Felt like someone who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed and now had to live in the space beyond them. At 7:30 that evening, he was escorted to division headquarters. Expected court-martial proceedings, expected formal charges, expected the end. Instead, he found Colonel Richard Sherman, division intelligence officer, studying Jacob's map with an expression somewhere between fury and fascination. Sherman was West Point, career officer, the kind of man who valued precision and order and following established doctrine. Everything Jacob had violated. "Sergeant Morrison," Sherman said without looking up, "you've created a significant problem." "Yes, sir." "Lieutenant Hayes wants you court-martialed for insubordination. He's not wrong. You violated a direct order. Multiple regulations. Probably a few laws of warfare I'd have to look up." "Yes, sir." Sherman set down the map, looked at Jacob directly. Eyes that had seen combat in the Great War. Eyes that understood things classroom officers never would. However, that single word changed everything. "In the 24 hours since you eliminated those spotter positions, German artillery effectiveness has dropped by 63%. He paused. "Let the number hang there. 63%, Sergeant. Do you understand what that means?" Jacob said nothing. "It means you've saved more lives in one day than most soldiers save in an entire war. It means every officer in this division would like to pin a medal on you, and every regulation says I should throw you in the stockade." Sherman leaned back, studied Jacob like he was a tactical problem that needed solving. "So we're going to do something else. You're going to teach your technique, not to scouts, to a specialized unit we're putting together. Men who can do what you did. Get close, eliminate spotters, destroy communications, disappear." Jacob blinked. This wasn't prison. This wasn't punishment. This was something he hadn't prepared for. "We're calling it deep reconnaissance," Sherman continued. "You'll train them, lead them, and if they're as effective as you've been, we'll expand the program across the entire Fifth Army." "I'm not being court-martialed?" Sherman smiled. It wasn't warm. "Oh, you're absolutely being court-martialed. But the sentence is suspended pending your service with the new unit. Consider it probation with extreme prejudice. You teach soldiers your shadow link technique. You lead missions. You don't get shot. Those are the terms." "Acceptable, sir." "Good. Report to Captain Reynolds tomorrow at 0600. Dismissed." Jacob left headquarters in a daze. Expected prison, got command instead. The Army worked in mysterious ways. The next 6 weeks were brutal. Captain Michael Reynolds was former OSS, had done similar work in North Africa before the Mediterranean campaign, understood that unconventional warfare required unconventional training. He assembled 12 men, scouts mostly, a few snipers, and one private who'd been given a choice between the Army and prison. Private Daniel Chen, 22 years old, from Brooklyn. Burglar before the war, caught breaking into a jewelry store in Manhattan. The judge said enlist or do 5 years. Chen chose Europe. Turned out the skills that made someone a good burglar also made them perfect for deep reconnaissance. Silent movement, lock-picking, understanding security patterns, infinite patience, reading people's attention the way Jacob read coal mine tunnels. Chen could pick locks in complete darkness, could move through buildings without sound, could case a position and find weaknesses that trained soldiers missed. When Jacob first met him, Chen was lounging against a tent pole looking thoroughly unimpressed. "So you're the guy who killed 17 Krauts with a knife," Chen said, Brooklyn accent thick as tar. "Congratulations. You want a medal or something?" Jacob studied him, saw past the attitude to something useful underneath. "You good at following orders?" "Depends on the orders." "Then you'll fit right in." They became friends within a week, brothers within 2. Jacob taught them everything he knew. Week 1 was reading attention patterns, where people look versus what they actually see, how peripheral vision collapses during concentration, how to identify gaps between observation sweeps. Week 2 was movement in blind spots, timing advances with environmental noise, wind and artillery and machinery, how to become part of the landscape rather than hiding from it. Week 3 was sound masking, moving when thunder rolls, when heavy equipment operates, when guards talk to each other and their attention commits elsewhere. Week 4 was psychological endurance, how to wait for hours without moving, how to control breathing under extreme stress, how to make the decision to kill and live with it afterward. They trained on mock German positions staffed by division personnel. Jacob would position observers with binoculars and radios, then send his trainees to eliminate them. Touch the shoulder without being detected. First week, everyone got caught. Second week, half got caught. Fourth week, 80% success rate. By the 6th week, they were ready. April 23rd, 1944. First operational mission. Target was a German spotter network in the ruins of Cisterna. 4 positions, 8 spotters, coordinating artillery fire that was stalling the Allied breakout. Division wanted them eliminated before the main offensive kicked off at dawn. Jacob split the team into 4 pairs, each targeting one position. He took the most exposed site, a bell tower overlooking the main road. His partner was Daniel Chen. They moved out at midnight, 12 men disappearing into Italian darkness like smoke. No one saw them leave. No one would see them return. Jacob and Chen reached the tower at 2:14. 2 German spotters inside, both awake, both equipped with night vision binoculars. Better equipment than Jacob had encountered on his solo mission, but they still had a pattern. Every 6 minutes, one spotter descended to check their supply cache on the ground floor. 30 seconds alone on each level. That was the gap. At 2:38, the first spotter descended. Jacob went up. Chen stayed below, upper level. Spotter focused on binoculars, watching Allied lines. Never heard Jacob approach. The knife opened his throat before he could turn. 8 seconds. Silent. Ground floor. Spotter examining supply crate. Chen from behind. Knife to kidney, then upward to heart. Body went rigid. 7 seconds. Total time for both kills, 15 seconds. Both radios destroyed. 0 shots fired. By 4:47, all 4 pairs had checked in. All 4 positions eliminated. 8 German spotters dead. 0 American casualties. The Allied offensive launched at dawn. German artillery fired blind. The breakout succeeded. Word spread faster this time. By May, Jacob was training 30 men. By June, the program had expanded to every division in 5th Army. Official name was Deep Reconnaissance Sections. But everyone knew the real name, Shadow Link Teams. And the Germans noticed. July 8, 1944. A German after-action report filed by Lieutenant Klaus Werner near Florence described responding to a missing spotter team. Found the position intact but abandoned. Radio destroyed. Blood on the floor. No bodies. Spotters had been dragged away and hidden. The report was chilling in its clinical detail. No signs of combat. No shell casings. No bullet impacts. Whoever eliminated our observers did so with knives in darkness, without triggering any alarm. Recommend immediate review of security protocols. Current defensive measures are ineffective against this form of infiltration. German soldiers started calling them Schattenjäger, shadow hunters. Spotters who'd felt safe for months suddenly realized they were being hunted by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't predict, couldn't defend against. Security patrols were doubled, tripwires installed, guard rotations increased. It didn't matter. Shadow link teams adapted, found new gaps, new patterns, new blind spots. By August, German spotter casualties in Italy had reached crisis levels. Artillery effectiveness continued declining. Conservative estimates suggested shadow link teams eliminated over 400 German spotters between March and September 1944. 400 men whose coordinates never came. 400 positions that went silent. 400 radios destroyed. But success brought scrutiny. September 3, 1944. Corps Headquarters, Brigadier General Marcus Whitfield, fresh from the States, West Point educated, no combat experience, and he'd read the reports on shadow link teams. His conclusion was simple. These tactics are assassination, not combat. Jacob stood at attention in front of Whitfield's desk. Captain Reynolds was there too, looking uncomfortable. These tactics violate the rules of warfare, Whitfield said. You're encouraging soldiers to murder enemy personnel. That's not soldiering, that's butchery. Jacob spoke quietly. German spotters direct artillery fire that kills our men by the dozen, from positions we can't reach with conventional tactics. Shadow link gets us close enough to stop them. Pause. If that's butchery, sir, then I'm a butcher. But Hayes and Anderson and Doherty are still dead because we followed conventional tactics. Whitfield's face reddened. I don't need a lecture on tactics from a sergeant. Jacob stepped over the line. Then don't lecture me on morality. Every man I've killed was killing us first. That's not murder. That's war. Silence in the room. Reynolds closed his eyes. Jacob had just ended his career, but Whitfield surprised everyone. He leaned back, studied Jacob for a long moment. You're right, he finally said, and I hate that you're right. War is ugly. Sometimes the ugliest tactics are the most effective. I'm not shutting down your program, Sergeant, but I want clear rules of engagement. Shadow link teams target spotters, radio operators, and forward observers only. No general infantry, no rear echelon personnel. You kill the men directing fire at our troops, nobody else. These are precision tactics, not a license for indiscriminate killing. Maintain that distinction. Jacob maintained it for the rest of the war. By May 1945, when the Italian campaign ended, shadow link teams had eliminated over 400 German spotters, destroyed countless radio stations, reduced enemy artillery effectiveness by an estimated 58% across all operational sectors. Conservative estimates credited the program with saving between 800 and 1,200 Allied lives. Jacob Morrison received no medal, no commendation, no official recognition. His name appeared only in classified after-action reports that remained sealed for 50 years. On May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany surrendered, Staff Sergeant Jacob Morrison was discharged from the United States Army. He took a bus back to Kentucky, returned to Harlan County like nothing had happened, got a job in construction, then mining again, because that's what men did in Harlan County. You worked with your hands. You didn't talk about things. You kept moving forward. He married Sarah, who worked at the diner on Main Street, a good woman who understood when Jacob woke at 3 in the morning and couldn't go back to sleep, who knew not to touch him when he was somewhere else in his mind. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Jacob never talked about the war, not to Sarah, not to his kids, not to anyone. Once a year on March 14th, Jacob would get a phone call. Daniel Chen from Brooklyn, now running a locksmith business. They'd talk for 10 minutes. Never about the war directly, just checking that they were still alive, still okay, still managing. You still having the dreams? Chen asked one year. Sometimes, Jacob said. Me too. They'd hang up, go back to their lives, wait for next March 14th. Jacob died on January 4th, 1987 in a hospital in Lexington. He was 62. Heart attack. His obituary in the Harlan Daily Enterprise was 4 paragraphs long. One paragraph mentioned his military service. Mr. Morrison served with distinction in the United States Army during World War II, stationed in Italy with the 3rd Infantry Division. No mention of Shadow Link. No mention of 12 spotters eliminated in one day. No mention of 400 more eliminated by teams he trained. His funeral was attended by 70 people. Sarah and his children and his grandchildren. But also Daniel Chen, who flew in from New York. Captain Reynolds retired and gray-haired from Virginia. A dozen other men Jacob had trained who showed up without being asked. They stood in the back during the service and didn't say much. After the burial, Reynolds approached Sarah. "Your husband saved my life," he said. "Probably saved it a dozen times. Just wanted you to know that." Sarah nodded. "He never talked about it. He wouldn't have. That was Jake. Did the work, came home, moved on." Years later, in 2003, a military historian named David Richardson was researching Italian campaign tactics, found a reference to specialized reconnaissance sections in a declassified Fifth Army report. He spent 4 years tracking down veterans, reading after-action reports, piecing together the story. His book, published in 2007, was titled Silent Hunters: Deep Reconnaissance in the Italian Campaign. An entire chapter was dedicated to Jacob Morrison. Richardson calculated that Shadow Link tactics reduced Allied casualties in Italy by approximately 11% across the 18 months they were operational. 11% doesn't sound like much. But in a campaign where 15,000 Americans died, 11% means over 1,600 soldiers, 1,600 men who came home instead of dying on Italian hillsides, 1,600 families who stayed whole instead of broken, 1,600 lives that continued because a coal miner from Kentucky learned how to move in shadows and taught others to do the same. That's Jacob Morrison's legacy. Not a medal, not a monument, just 1,600 men who got to see their families again. And that's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees examining doctrine, not through generals planning elegant strategies from comfortable headquarters, through sergeants who watch their friends die and decide they won't watch anymore, through men who break rules because the rules are killing people, through techniques developed in darkness and taught in whispers because official channels move too slow and men are dying too fast. Shadow Link violated doctrine, violated tactical theory, violated career officers' sense of how warfare should be conducted, cleanly, from a distance, with proper authorization. But it worked. And in war, working matters more than anything else. Jacob Morrison understood that, so he did what needed doing, accepted the consequences, went home when it was over. No fanfare, no glory, just the quiet knowledge that he'd done something that mattered. March 14th, 1944. 1 coal miner, 1 knife, 17 enemy soldiers, and a technique that changed American warfare forever. That's not just history, that's legacy. The kind of legacy that doesn't need monuments or medals. The kind that lives in the 1,600 men who came home, in their children and grandchildren, in the families that got to stay whole because one sergeant had the courage to break every rule when the rules weren't working. That's the American spirit. Not blind obedience, not following orders because they're orders, but having the moral courage to do what's right when what's right contradicts what's expected. We need that spirit today. We need people willing to stand up and say the old way isn't working. We need to try something new. We need people who will risk everything to do what's right. We need Jacob Morrisons. And maybe that's the real lesson here, that the greatest acts of courage aren't always the ones that get recognized. Sometimes they're the ones that happen in darkness, the ones that save lives without fanfare, the ones carried by men who come home and never talk about it. Jacob Morrison saved 1,600 lives, trained hundreds of men in techniques that are still used today, changed how America fights wars, and he did it all by trusting his instincts over doctrine. By remembering lessons learned in Kentucky coal mines. By having the courage to break rules when breaking them meant saving lives. That's worth remembering. That's worth honoring. That's the legacy of Shadows.